Hi, everybody. Welcome to the very last week of the semester, week 15, and we're going to be talking about the ways in which people make meaning. Among those things, art, play, religion, and the corresponding chapter is chapter 16, How Do We Make Meaning? Now, again, I think for like, I don't know, 5, 6 weeks now, I've been starting off with this slide, and I never really included things around meaning making, okay? And that doesn't mean that it's a trivial thing. And I like to end the semester with that, not because it's less important than anything else we've talked about. It's equally important, and it's very closely related to all these things here around social organization. So the economic systems that people have, their political systems, ideas around gender and sexuality, family, marriage, stratification, and so forth, all winds up having meaning for people, okay? And so where does meaning fit into all those things? Well, the ways in which humans make meaning help explain why things are the way they are for people. So you go around the world in different cultures, different systems of thinking, and people will have ways of explaining, say, if that particular society has a hierarchy, or if they're more egalitarian. Well, the ways in which they make meaning, whether it be through religious ideology or other things, those things will make sense given a system of meaning, and they're given meaning through the things that people say and do about them. Ways in which people make meaning also help justify the ways in which people do things. So if there are patterns of events in a society, people have certain ways of doing things, whether it be how people relate to each other or just the way in which they go about, say, for example, structuring their community. Where are the homes located, and how close are they together? So are they arranged in a circle, or are they in linear streets? All these things, there's meaning behind it. Okay, the ways in which people the ways in which people make meaning also help foster social harmony and mend social disharmony. So all the stuff we looked at before might it appears very survival based, right? People are adapted to an environment. There are certain possibilities for ways of making a living and getting food in those environments. Some things you can do, some things you can't do. And then based on that, people will structure their societies, sometimes having to do with how big their populations are, what kind of governance system can go well with that, what kind of economic system can go well with that. And, humans being humans, there are going to be conflicts around all of those things. And the systems whereby people make meaning for their existence help people bond to a certain extent. That doesn't always work. So like I said, there's conflict. So those meaning systems can wind up giving meaning to those conflicts and help find ways to mend them, whether they're within a group or between groups. And sometimes the conflict itself winds up being meaningful, as we know, for better or for worse. So the ways in which people make meaning also help people cope with an uncertain and difficult world. So if life were just about survival, getting food, finding shelter, getting water, that would be a very boring world indeed. But it's never been like that for humans, because humans, for as long as we've been able to call ourselves humans, have had symbolic thinking. And when you have symbolic thinking, you attach meaning to things. So regardless of where you are in the world and what cultural lifestyle you are brought up in, it winds up taking on meaning for the group of people that you are a part of, but also for you as an individual. And that's true for people in the small scale societies that have egalitarian lives and maybe spend a portion of their day getting food and the portion of their day in ritual activity, another portion relaxing and feasting. or whether you're in one of these big nation states where we have this hierarchy and this stratification with social inequalities, and that winds up being more difficult than for some people than others. Obviously, the higher you are in the echelons, the presumably life gets a little bit easier. They say, money doesn't fix everything, but you certainly have more opportunities and freedoms the wealthier you are and the less discrimination that you face. So the ways in which people make meaning, wherever you are on that scale, you wind up finding ways for it to be meaningful. It means something. It might not always mean a good thing, but it means something. So life isn't just about trudging along. So in other words, we end with this topic to kind of look at how, humans are creative, humans are resilient, and life is more than just about survival, because things are permeated with meanings. The things that we say, the things that we do, the things that we experience, it all winds up being about, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be who I am here right now with all my different intersecting identities? So the authors of the textbook kind of approach this in an interesting way. Usually this kind of chapter is more based on religion and spirituality, but they include other forms of creative thinking in there. And I think that's really interesting, because it's relevant to think about these things as well as we go through life and the different ways in which we do create meaning. So they point out it's fun. Obviously, we play, and not just kids, right? At all ages, people play, and it's fun, but it's not just fun. And this is kind of something that happens among pretty much all mammals. If you have a pet cat or dog, they play, right? And so that's kind of a part of development. And pretty much across the class of mammals. Humans, of course, play in more complex ways because of symbolic thinking. And if we look at our closest relatives among non-human primates, they probably play in more complex ways than, say, cats or dogs. Not because they're better or more evolved, they just, primates have evolved in such a way that lends itself to more symbolic thinking than other mammals, for example, and humans have more complex symbolic thinking than all the other primates. So that winds up being reflected in the kinds of things that humans play at any age. So when you think back to the games that you play when you're a kid, you learn a lot of social values and the nature of social relations in your society, right? Through role playing, or even things like board games, or all kinds of games that people play help kind of embody these things about your culture. So when we talked way back near the beginning of the semester about culture and how it's learned and shared, well, learning culture isn't just, and we talked about this, isn't just straight instruction. You go sit and somebody teaches you all about your culture. It's through engaging with the world, and one of the ways in which this happens is through play. So socialization happens through play, and culturation happens through play. And in some circumstances, it helps learn survival skills as well. And there's prehistoric evidence for this that you can read about in the textbook. Now, art, sometimes when we talk about prehistory, archaeological finds, some of it is kind of prehistoric art. You see, cave art, or, pottery, which can have a practical purpose but is sometimes decorated, right? So art has been a part of humankind for a long time. And it's also something that's possible because of symbolic thinking. Remember, when we talk about symbolic thinking, a symbol is something that stands for something else. When we play, we use symbols. If you pretend, when you're playing, a lot of playing winds up being pretend. And anytime you're pretending, you're using symbols. You're doing things. Maybe you're a kid pretending to be an orchestra conductor, and you might use a pen as what's the name of those things conductors used? Any music students here? Like you do the thing, and this is representing something else, right? Any kind of, and here's where, play and art, like if you perform in theater, or any kind of performance, like we'll talk about playing an instrument, being in a play. So the authors of the textbook do that too. They kind of actually describe the way they define art is almost as a kind of play, because you can be creative, you can imagine things that are not there, and you need to be able to think symbolically to be able to do that. You can have things stand for things that are not there, for abstract ideas. When you look, if you've ever taken an art class and you go to a museum and you're thinking about the symbolism in a painting, lyrics to songs have symbolism, right? So we can do art because of that capacity that we have. So that being said, art can do all kinds of things. It can reflect social values, and often if you take, again, like an art course, not necessarily for creating art, but where you're, like art history or something like that, you can kind of, sometimes they'll talk about some historical circumstances in which a certain art tradition emerged, right? And how it can reflect some changes in philosophy at the time in a certain society, right? Or certain social movements. So when we talk about art reflecting social values, in some cases it can be connected with a dominant ideology. So when you have any social context where you have a group kind of trying to either establish or maintain power, often some works of art will be used, some people would call it propaganda, right? But just kind of to convey messages to the population that justify domination, right? And we already talked about domination when we talked about political organization, where you can dominate through force and coercion, but over the longer term, it's less expensive and easier to maintain domination if you change people's ideologies. And one way to influence people is through art. But on the flip side, it can also be connected with resistance to domination and all the values that come with that. So any of you who are interested in any kind of social revolutions, past or present, you'll see that different art forms. And when I say art, I mean, music, painting, graffiti, graphic novels, comic books, anything that's creative, really. And you see that a lot of resistance movements, music in particular is a big part of resistance movements, street art, all kinds of, things like that. So that, again, we're still talking about people kind of reaching out with a certain message, whether it's a message of like, no, you should all kind of adhere to these values, or no, we will not put up with that, these conditions, and we're going to fight back. There are values being transmitted. Art can also promote social connectedness, make people feel a sense of belonging to a wider group. And, there's a bit of discussion in the textbook, there's about, in terms of, well, how do you assess what is art? And there's some cultural relativism needed here with respect to different aspects of this. So, for example, again, if you've taken any art classes, or if you hang out with people who are some kind of artistic professional, or even somebody who's not, and they'll go to a museum exhibit, and sometimes they'll look at something that to them looks like a heap of trash, and they're like, well, what is art? Well, that's not art, right? And so you have that, like, in the worlds of, like, associated with different art forms. But then cross-culturally, you also have this thing where when you go to museums, sometimes you have things that in their cultures of origins were not necessarily considered to be art. They might have artistic aspects to them in terms of decorative elements, but sometimes they might have been ceremonial things. Masks are a big one here. So they give that example where, during colonization and different incidences of warfare in the world, there has been a lot of theft, and some of the things that were stolen were ceremonial items from different indigenous and other populations in the world. So if you go to a museum sometimes and you see a lot of masks, sometimes they'll say just these broad categories of Native American masks or African masks. Sometimes these were items that were ceremonial and that were stolen, and they were never meant to be art put up on a wall. Some museums are now kind of repatriating these and giving them back, but there's, there are many incidences of that. So, unfortunately, there's this ethnocentric thing again where if, Westerners, colonial people who were descended from colonial powers would see something and then, oh, that looks quaint and that looks cute, hey, that would look great on my wall or in a museum, whereas the people who created this had a much different meaning for them. So you got to be careful with that. There's also different cultural ideas about, stylistic norms relative to art forms, right? So you'll see culture reflected even just in indigenous North America. Sometimes people will look, you might go to one of these stores in Old Montreal that aren't run by indigenous people for the most part, by the way. The only one that I know of is Espace Ashukan. You can go there and legitimately, ethically buy indigenous art, but most of the other ones in Old Montreal, they're not owned by indigenous people, so be very careful. But a lot of the stuff you'll see that's very popular is actually from West Coast First Nations. And that has a certain style to it. When you see these totem poles, which also were not, as far as I know, art per se, but more ceremonial, that's a West Coast thing. Indigenous peoples in this area did not have these, right? So if you look at Anishinaabe art, it looks different than the art of First Nations on the West Coast, which looks different from Ganyegehaga, or what you might know as Mohawk. Inuit art looks different, right? And again, if you went to, that's the other thing that is annoying when you see something like African art, because Africa is a huge continent with thousands and thousands of cultures, all with their different, traditions. So there's tremendous amount of variation of art there, and what's considered to be artistic, and so on and so forth. So far, so we're still on this topic of having creative minds with symbolic thinking and ways in which we create meaning and share meaning. So then we get into, this last segment, and then most of the chapter does wind up being more about, what we would call religion, which, some anthropologists distinguish between religion and spirituality. The authors of this textbook don't. I'm tapping it here as though you could see me, but really, the textbook's right here next to me, the physical copy. And, so the authors of this textbook don't distinguish, so we won't either, just to keep things simple. Again, when we're in person, we get to go into more depth. But if you're interested in this, if you have a huge interest in this topic, every fall there's a course called Anthropology of the Supernatural. I taught it for over 10 years, every fall, and we decided to switch things up, so now my colleague Matthew Sasoyan is teaching it. So that's something, if you're interested in what we're about to talk about for the rest of these slides, that's a course you could take in the fall. So I'm going in the order of the textbook. I would have talked about the concept of religion first, but okay, we'll go in their order. Makes things a bit easier for you as the end user, I think, if you're using these slides to guide you through the textbook. So myth. So here's one of those, I've said this before about other terms like, political and economic, and how anthropologists use terms differently than everybody else sometimes. And in everyday language, when you hear the word myth, usually it's preceded by just right? As in, oh, that's just a myth. So a lot of people use it to mean an untrue story. So kind of thing, like urban legends, right? The whole thing with Bloody Mary and the mirror, or, fairy tales or things like that. But in anthropology, when we talk about myths, it's not an insult, right? It's any story that explains how things came to be. So how the world came to be, or just certain elements of the world, like a certain location, like a mountain. Maybe there's a story about how that was created. Social structure, right? So they give an example in the textbook of a society where there was a story behind the origins of different kinship groupings and which groups had access to what land, right? And so there's a story that explains a very real social structure and things like that, right? It could be the origins of a ritual. It can be anything that's described in a story. So anthropologists aren't concerned about whether a story is true in the objective sense, like this really happened or this did not happen. So if anthropologists who are interested in, say, the origins of some of the big world religions like Christianity, Judaism, and they're looking at the stories in sacred texts, these are, in anthropological terms, they're all considered myths, again, not as an insult, but because they have stories that carry meaning and that transmit explanations and understanding of how the world is. So that term applies whether it's a written story in a sacred text or a story that's been transmitted orally from generation to generation, as has been the case in many indigenous societies. So it's not about, being able to check, and anthropologists aren't there to prove or disprove stories and say which ones are better than others. It's about values and meaning. Okay, so how does a story relate to a culture or a cultural and historical context? What values and knowledge does it transmit? So that's what anthropologists are interested in. And in that course that I was telling you about, Anthropology of the Supernatural, we usually can spend a few weeks looking at different kinds of myths that exist, and what they do for people and how they relate to other aspects of culture and other aspects of religious thinking. So again, this is what I was saying before. It's not about truth in the objective, verifiable sense. It's more about truth in the sense of truths. When people say speak your truth, it's like a value system kind of thing almost. Their experiences, identity. So it's more about that. So I put here some links. So when you download these slides, you can click on this link. There's a 5-minute, and I think, normally if we were in person, I would take time to kind of look at this, because I think that if you live and work in the area of Tiohtià:ke, what is commonly known as Montreal, you're a Vanier student, you study in somewhere that's based in this territory, it's important to know about the local culture and people, and I said this way in the beginning of the semester, we commonly acknowledge the Kanien'kehá:ka, or Mohawk Nation, as the caretakers of these lands. They are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which you might have heard referred to in high school as the Iroquois Confederacy. And so it's kind of, if you live around here, it's kind of important to know the creation story and other stories. So there are many versions of it, and it's actually a very long story, but here's a 5-minute version of it that I encourage you to look at. And if you're really into this stuff, there's a series on YouTube. If you've ever heard of Crash Course, they have a bunch of different kinds of topics, with anything from math to geography to history, all kinds of stuff. It's really awesome. And they have one series on world mythology, and I think they have like 25 videos, and they're usually between 15 and 20 minutes each, and they're fun, and they really look at different themes. So creation stories, for example. Okay, how did the world come to be? And you'll see they're different around the world, but there are some common themes that come back, like a flood or some kind of creation out of some void. And then there are different then they go from there and they look at different themes from myths around the world, and parts of it are animated. So if you're really into this and you're looking for something to watch at some point that's kind of fun and educational, I encourage you to click on that second link and have a look. And when I taught Anthropology of the Supernatural, I used some of those. So the second big theme within that kind of the scope of religious thinking that's discussed in the textbook is ritual. And this is very closely related to the idea of myth. But first we can take a detour and just look at ritual in a more general sense. Ritual, and the authors of this textbook aren't the only ones who say this, but in and of itself, rituals don't have to be religious. They can be non-religious. Okay, so ritual itself, it's just, they kind of go through a 4-part definition here, and you see different versions of this in different textbooks, but this one is kind of helpful. So basically, something counts as a ritual, anthropologically speaking, if it consists of this kind of repeated pattern sequence of activities. So it's kind of like you'll have a context in which there are certain actions that are always done pretty much the same way and often pretty much in the same order. Okay? And a ritual is also separate from regular daily life, so it's kind of time and space that's marked aside from everything else that you do in your regular life. It's a recognizable schema within a culture, so that's kind of more of a vague, they explained it a little bit, but basically what that boils down to is that even if you're within a culture, if somebody shows up at a ritual they've never been to before, they can still tell by the pattern of the way things happen and the atmosphere of the context, how people comport themselves, what actually happens, what is said. They can tell it's a ritual, right? Even if they've never been to that particular kind of ritual before. So it's kind of like, imagine you're walking around in a neighborhood you've never been in, and you encounter some kind of like procession, and people are quiet and they're all carrying candles. Maybe you're not sure what they're doing, because maybe they're wearing clothing that you've never seen before, and they're maybe chanting in a language you've never heard before. But because of what they're doing, because you've seen similar things like that before, and there are some clues there about, oh, this is some kind of ritualistic activity here. All right, you can tell even if you've never seen this before, been a part of it before. So that's when we talk about schema. It's really kind of it's a bunch of little clues that you wouldn't necessarily be able to verbalize even or put your finger on, but you just kind of know, right? And rituals are also related to cultural ideas, so sometimes learned and shared through myth. The authors of the textbook describe it as like these things that are encoded in myth. So that's where we see that crossover, and why we say sometimes, because again, not all ritual is religious, but when it is, often there are myths that either explain the ritual, how it came to be, or the ritual involves retelling or even acting out parts of myths. When they're non-religious, there's still cultural ideas involved about how things should proceed and who is supposed to do what, who has the authority to do what, who places themselves where in the space. So they give some examples here, and some of them are, so a wedding. You can have a civic wedding, right? They're not all religious, or you can have a religious one, but either way, there's some kind of ritualistic activity involved. A graduation ceremony, most of the time they're fairly secular, unless I guess you're at a religious school where there would be religious components to it, but the practice in and of itself can look pretty similar across the board. There's a sequence of events. There's that song. I didn't believe this, but the first time I actually went to a Vanier graduation as a teacher, one of the people who actually was giving out diplomas on the stage, as the students were coming in, you'll experience this hopefully, because maybe by the time you graduate we'll be back on campus, but that song that you hear in the movies, the na, 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 like they were actually playing that. I was like, wow, I thought that was only in the movies, but there you go. It's a ritualistic thing, and the students come in while that song is happening, and then the names get called by program. They also put like a lab experiment, and I thought that's great, because it really drives it home that ritual isn't necessarily religious. If any of you took science courses in high school where you had some lab experiments, or maybe some of you are in science now and you're taking biology or chemistry or physics and you have these labs, and where you get to do experiments, it's kind of, there is certain patterns of events, and this is kind of marked off, right? Because an experiment, it's like you're isolating your variables, and certain things need to happen a certain way. So it's interesting to think about that. What are the roles of religious ritual? I mean, it's just like we said, play is fun, but it's not just fun. Well, religious ritual isn't just... So, okay, we established that not all ritual is religious, but now we'll kind of zoom in on religious ritual. Well, what do people do as part of ritual? There are values that are shared, morals, behavioral codes, right? Sometimes, like I said, sometimes myths are either told or acted out in some way. It's like if you were raised Catholic and you do the Stations of the Cross, like, so almost you're kind of acting out that story, right? Transmitting religious or other knowledge, right? So one of the things that when I talk about, like, say, the oral tradition among Indigenous peoples here in particular, storytelling, if you go to Indigenous events, you'll see storytelling is a huge part of socializing, like in these kind of contexts, sometimes where people organize events, but also in teaching and learning. And it's not just the kind of spiritual knowledge or religious knowledge that's been kind of encoded in stories that are told, sometimes in these ritual contexts. It's historical knowledge, okay, about the people themselves, maybe older migrations that happened, the history of the environment, environmental knowledge, survival based knowledge, right? That are transmitted. So ritual kind of sometimes provides a context for that. Promoting social cohesion. When people come together as a group, they can feel bonded with each other. This is one of the reasons why the Indian Act in Canada, which is a piece of legislation, it's a set of rules that govern First Nations identities. If you didn't know that this exists, it's one of the most racist, it's the most racist piece of legislation that exists. It's existed since Canada began, and it's still on the books. They've changed it, but for a while, for about I think 100 years, they banned Indigenous ceremonies because they knew this is how people got together, and they didn't want that. They were trying to split people apart and assimilate them, right? So we know this. People come together for ritual, and they feel a sense of communion with their spiritual beings, but also with each other. Some cases they can be about social control. We know that as well because all religions at their base are about love and peace and harmony and sharing and generosity and all this sort of thing. But we also know that sometimes political ideologies interfere with that, and so that sometimes rituals can be used for social control. And there's a whole set of ritual, and normally we would spend more time on this, but again, we're online and we're asynchronous, so but there are a few pages in the textbooks. I encourage you to look at that if you're interested in this. It could even be something for your final paper if you wanted to talk about that a little bit and make the link with, say, gender or things like that. So rites of passage, anthropologists love to talk about rites of passage because the rite of passage, they're present in pretty much every culture, and it's kind of ritual that not only helps mark the transition from one stage of life to another or one identity to another, but actively makes it real, right? So when you think about, say, a wedding, the wedding isn't just marking two people marrying each other. It allows it to happen, right? So in some contexts, without a wedding, you're not married, right? I was raised, I'm no longer Catholic, but I was raised Catholic, and there was very much this idea that you can be physically born, but if you're not baptized, you're not legit, right? So, that rite of passage makes it real. There are a lot of cultures where there are coming of age rites of passage that are very significant. You don't become a woman or a man or a member of a third gender in cases where there are recognition of these, and there might be a rite of passage associated with that as well, but it's not real. You're not recognized as such until you've gone through that rite of passage. So, even death, right? So you have some kind of funeral thing that marks the passage of that person from being alive to not being alive and going to some other place, their soul going to some other place. But it's also a rite of passage for the people that are left alive, because it might change somebody's status from, say, wife to widow, for example. So rites of passage are interesting, and there's kind of they have their own sequence where, there's like the separation from the rest of your community, and then there's this position of being in between worlds where you're not fully of the older status, but you're not the new one yet, right? And there's kind of danger. So, sometimes you hear that thing of like the groom's not supposed to see the bride until the actual ceremony. Well, she's kind of locked away and with her, entourage and putting on the dress and all that, and that there's that period of danger. Coming of age ceremonies are the same way. Often in societies that do this, you'll have all the people of a similar age taken together, maybe outside the village, with elders teaching them stuff, and this is kind of a dangerous time where you could fall ill or different things, right? And so that period of liminality is something that is super, again, anthropologists love to talk about this because in periods of liminality, all kinds of things can happen. You're in between worlds. And so, yeah, it's exciting stuff. And then that third stage is that you come back to your community and you're recognized as your new status, whether it be a married person or a full-fledged grown-up with all the rights and responsibilities that come with that. So effectively, the rite of passage helped you transition from one stage to another. It's not enough that you're going through physical changes. So all that being said, our textbook, and we finally get to, well, what is religion anyway? So before we talk about religion, it's important to kind of go back to a term we've spoken about a few times, worldview. And you're probably all familiar with this term because I know it comes up in a lot of your classes, and I know that, for example, in humanities, you all have to take a course that's under the topic of worldviews. Essentially, a worldview is a way of seeing the world, right, and understanding reality. It's more complex than this. I mean, when I have more time to talk about this stuff, and when I teach Anthro the Supernatural, we talk about worldview, and sometimes we spend quite a lot of time out on it, breaking it down, because it goes beyond just like, oh, I think this is that. It's really deeply entrenched, and it's influenced by culture. It's influenced by our identities in the world and how we interact with the world, our individual life experiences, group experiences, major defining events. For example, this pandemic that we're going through is going to shape our collective and individual worldviews for a very long time, probably the rest of our lives, right? Other big events like people who've gone through different wars, that shapes your worldview. Okay, so religion is one type of worldview among others, right? So if it's a way of seeing the world, well, religions are among that. There are other ways of seeing the world that are not religious, and they can coexist with religious worldviews. They can intersect with them. None of these things are mutually exclusive. So religion is a kind of worldview, and in a cross-cultural and anthropological context, so the authors of our textbook, cite Bowie, who, not David Bowie, another Bowie. There are a few anthropologists named Bowie. There's Fiona Bowie and this one, I don't remember his name now, who both write on the anthropology of religion, so I don't know if they're related or married or something. So he defined religion as ideas and practices that postulate a reality beyond that which is immediately available to the senses. And that's an interesting and very broad way of putting it. As I mentioned, there are some in anthropology and outside of anthropology who distinguish between religion and spirituality, and they'll say religion is more organized and spirituality is more individualized. But this captures all of that, because really it's any system of thought that assumes that there are things that we can't see with our eyes, hear with our ears, touch with our hands, right? And that you kind of can communicate with, whether they're beings or forces or in other places, entirely other ways of being, that you need different ways to access those things than your physical senses. All right? Some people, and they talk about this in the textbook, would refer to this as a belief in something supernatural, which includes gods, ghosts, anything that's beyond those immediate senses. But because there's cultural variation with regards to the distinction between what's natural and what isn't, some anthropologists stay away from that. Our course that I mentioned is called Anthropology of the Supernatural, but that was created before I even started teaching at Vanier, and so it's kind of outdated language, and we can't just change the name of a course according to the government. It's really complicated, so it's annoying. So all that said, there's a lot of variety in terms of what that can look like. So what is immediately available, what's beyond that which is immediately available to the senses, that can be all kinds of things. That can include a belief in some kind of cosmic being or power. Sometimes people assume that it's all about gods. Not necessarily. So religion doesn't, in this sense, in the anthropological sense, that very broad sense, that what we just saw in the previous slide, that which beyond something, that a reality beyond that which is immediately available to the senses, can include gods, or it can include gods and other things, or no gods at all, maybe just spirits, maybe ancestral spirits, maybe it's forces, like these impersonal forces or energies that some people believe in. Okay, so it can be any of that. So it's not necessarily based on a belief in gods. That's important to kind of think about, because the big world religion often are based in a belief in gods, whether it's one god in the case of monotheistic religions or multiple gods in the case of polytheistic religions. But that leads some to think that that's all religions are, when in fact, again, in this course, we've focused over and over again on the fact that there are many different kinds of social structures in the world, and there are small-scale societies with very localized beliefs that don't necessarily involve gods. We talked a few weeks ago about the Zhohuanzi, in that whole section on consumption, and how they have more than they need and want because they don't want or need a lot of things. And so they think about value in very different ways than Westerners. And their religious thought doesn't, there, I think there's a creator god, but then that creator god just kind of ignores them the rest of the time. Who they're in contact with most often is like spirits and ghosts of people who died, right? So gods can sometimes exist but not be as important as other things. Sometimes it's the opposite. So another anthropologist named Wallace is cited in the textbook on these pages here, and he lists more than there are there, but some common elements that you can observe. They might not look the same in all these different cultural contexts, but you'll often see these things as part of religious thought systems. So for example, prayer, so some kind of way of asking beings in the supernatural world for help, sacrifice, things that are taboo. You're not supposed to do that because that'll offend the gods or the spirits or someone. Physiological exercise, so which are often altered states of consciousness. They can involve intoxicants, hallucinogens. We talk about this a lot in anthropology of the supernatural, at least when I teach it, because it's another one of those things. When we talked about rites of passage before, sometimes they involve altered states of consciousness, because a lot of people in the world and a lot of systems of thinking, they'll think that, because when you're in an altered state of consciousness, whether you're dreaming or you're drunk or you're stoned or you're sleep deprived, your physical sensations are different, and with that comes this state of awareness that's different than usual, and some people equate that with being in touch with the supernatural world. So that being said, there are certain kinds of societies that have, maybe they don't have these kind of big organized religions with a hierarchy, and their religious practitioners, you might have heard the word shaman before. It's a problematic term. They don't talk about it in the textbook, about the problematic origins of the term. The thing is that, well, the origins aren't problematic. It's more that the word originates in one specific cultural context. So there are many indigenous peoples in Russia, by the way. Maybe you didn't know this. And in Siberia, one of those indigenous populations is the Tungus people. I might not be pronouncing it properly. And that word kind of came from that language, and anthropologists wind up using it to similar kinds of specialists in small-scale cultures around the world, including indigenous people here, indigenous peoples in Africa, kinds of different places. But each of those places has their own word for these terms, and it's kind of, some people kind of say, it's a bit of appropriation there to take this term from one language to apply it to everywhere, and it's not necessarily exactly the same thing. But all that said, this is what they're talking about in the textbook, is these practitioners in small-scale societies with their own kind of localized religious belief systems and practices, and these people are seen as having the ability, either through training or sometimes they're kind of born with some ability, to communicate directly with spirits, or even to travel to the cosmic world, such as the land of the dead or the world of spirits. And often they're seen as people who have healing capacities, because their communication with spirit allows them to kind of manipulate the supernatural world or ask for help directly from the supernatural world to be able to heal people either psychologically or physically. And often the training that they undergo with the mentor, say if they're an apprentice to another shaman, involves a lot of ritual and a lot of these altered states of consciousness that we were talking about, because often shamans are able to travel to these other places because of these altered states of consciousness. They'll go into trances, things that might look and feel a little bit like possessive states of possession. So that's one thing that cross-culturally can be be seen, regardless of the word you use. And again, every culture that has this kind of practitioner, they'll have their own word. And another religious practitioner that's common, again, the word priest, I know is not used by all of the big world religions, but anthropologically, and I don't, against another thing that I don't really agree with, but often in these textbooks you'll see priest used to apply to all figures. So, for example, imams and rabbis, right? Any kind of specialist that is a part of these bigger kind of institutionalized, organized religions where there's a hierarchy, right? Because there's usually some people, these big world religions that are institutionalized tend to have originated in societies that had some kind of hierarchy. And so, and now they've spread to a lot of smaller scale societies, especially Christian religions through colonization. But then, so in this context, then these particular kinds of specialists that anthropologists refer to as priests, even if in their local systems they're not referred to that way, they tend to be responsible for running rituals, right? And they're also responsible for kind of, through this ritual activity, mediating between the people and the deities of that religions. So it has a different flavor than shamans, because shamans in these small scale societies, they're pretty much just another person. People might be a little bit scared of them sometimes because of their special powers, or they might honor them a little bit more, but they're still just regular people who might also do other things for a living. They might go out hunting, or planting crops, or all the other things that people do when they're not being called to, say, heal someone. Whereas priests, priestly figures in the anthropological sense, tend to be that's what they do in life, pretty much. So, which makes sense because they're part of these kind of big institutionalized and organized religions. Whereas in smaller scale society, religion is just kind of integrated into everyday life in different ways. So the last topic that we're looking here is witchcraft, and it's related to what we've been talking about, in the sense that if we're talking about beliefs that involve realities beyond our immediate senses, then that includes things like magic and witchcraft, which is something that people in many cultures believe in. Now, again, there's problems with terminology here, because in anthropology it winds up being applied to cross-cultural beliefs that people in many cultures have, that some humans can use magic to achieve certain ends. And magic is kind of, a practice where people can use energies or even just physical objects to kind of manipulate the supernatural world in some way. And unfortunately, the terms in original languages, so we'll talk about the Azande shortly, their term for this wouldn't necessarily translate to the English meaning of witchcraft. So again, like with priests and like with shaman, it's kind of like probably not the best word, because in English the term, well, it has older origins than this, meaning, with words, old English words that mean like a wise woman, for example. So there's that history there too. But in more recent times it kind of it's very closely related to a period of European thought related to older Christian ideas about witches making pacts with the devil, right? And so unfortunately that idea of witchcraft, if when we apply this to other cultural practices that are not this, people get the wrong idea, right? When that's not what we're talking about at all. So that idea from that time period in Europe doesn't line up with cross-cultural ideas about witchcraft. It also doesn't correspond to neo-pagan ideas about witchcraft. So if you have anybody in your life who practices Wicca or other forms of neo-pagan witchcraft, I know some people don't like the term neo-pagan. I'm part of that community, so we can talk about it one-on-one if you have a problem with this. But, people who practice witchcraft in one of those forms will likely take offense at this catch-all meaning of witchcraft as well. So that's kind of the disclaimer here, but very much in anthropology, unfortunately, when they're using that term witchcraft in a cross-cultural sense, they're referring to kind of this belief that some people have, that some people can do bad things through magic. So cross-culturally, a lot of cultures do have this belief that some individuals can either intentionally or unintentionally cause harm to others using magic. So again, in these cultures and languages, they wouldn't use the word witchcraft, they would have their own word for it. So it's just unfortunate that anthropologists have used the term witchcraft to apply to these beliefs because it doesn't really fit. It doesn't translate well, okay? So the Azande example is a classic. This anthropologist, E. Evans Pritchard, you can't read anything about the anthropology of witchcraft without reading about him. He spent a lot of time among the Azande, and the Azande are a group of people living in kind of the central area of the African continent. And in their belief system, this is caused by a substance in the body, and it can act of its own accord whether the person knows it or not. Maybe they're sleeping and that substance kind of travels to go do something to someone. Maybe they had negative feelings towards somebody. Maybe there's a little conflict. But, it doesn't, in this belief system, that doesn't mean the person's evil, right? They just kind of lost control of this for a little while. So what you see here, and I'm oversimplifying, you can read more in the textbook. If somebody gets accused of this, usually it's somebody that somebody's already in conflict with. So if somebody gets ill and they suspect witchcraft, then the obvious people to accuse will be people maybe that they had conflicts with, right? So that said, an accusation happens, and then they'll have other kinds of rituals to figure out who to confirm who it was, and then there's even a kind of ritual to appease the relation, so the person can kind of, if they acknowledge, okay, maybe this was me, but I didn't do it on purpose, they can kind of, it's not described in this book, but I've read it elsewhere, where they can do something with cold water to kind of cool down the witchcraft, in other words. And this sometimes gets people talking again, resolving their conflicts, or if somebody's been acting against the norm, it might be a way to bring them back into line, So again, it's in some places, yeah, people will have beliefs that people are bad if they're doing these things, but in this particular example, it's interesting because it's more about, in the end, it's about resolving conflicts a lot of the time. And of course people have conflicts. That's what part of being human is. And so these kinds of things, it puts all the cards on the table, in other words. It allows people to kind of air their frustrations and then resolve them with community support. So just to kind of wrap all that up, again, I'm going through all this so fast, we could have, again, a whole semester where we're talking just about this week's material, and I've done so in that other course, so it's hard for me to condense this. I apologize, but it's very exciting stuff. I love this stuff. So these beliefs and practices related to witchcraft, whether it's the Azande or even anywhere else, and again, witchcraft in that problematic sense that's based in a faulty understanding, they reflect social relations a lot of the time. So they'll reflect existing tensions within a group or between groups, because Mary Douglas, another famous anthropologist, kind of showed how in some societies, with people who will be accused of witchcraft are within the society. Maybe there are certain kinds of individuals, or sometimes it's people in another group, right? So that allows people in the group to come together against that other group, right? Often, people who are already stigmatized or in conflict might be more likely to be accused. So when we just looked at the Azande example, if somebody you've been in conflict with, so this is a society where polygyny does exist. So sometimes co-wives, we've talked about this before, where sometimes co-wives do get along for the most part, but humans are humans. Sometimes there will be conflict, and so maybe they've come into conflict. So you're one of these co-wives, you get sick, you're pretty sure it's witchcraft. Well, then maybe that co-wife that you've been butting heads with is going to be, somebody you've been in conflict with. Other examples, so when we think back to those European witch trials, maybe you've learned about this in high school or in other courses, the people that were often the first targets of witchcraft accusations were older widowed women, because this was a very patriarchal time in European history, and if an older woman was a widow and she had no man to take care of her, she could be stigmatized because of her age, because of being alone, and yeah, they were often the first targets, and women in general. Some men were accused, but often it was women, because the Christian church, the Catholic church, saw women as too weak to resist Satan and to be very lustful and things like that. So all of these things, the idea when anthropologists look at this, it's not to go, ha ha ha, look at those fools believing in this. It's more about, how does this make sense? Because Evans Pritchard, and I really encourage you to read that section, he was kind of looking at how rational the thinking was behind this. People didn't think that things were only due to witchcraft, but the fact that they happened at a particular time could be due to witchcraft. Right, so there's still kind of rational thinking that's involved here, and the conclusion that something is caused by this and not this other thing has to do with a worldview that's in place. Anyway, I'll stop it here because we could go on forever, and I feel like I have. Last PowerPoint of the year, I said, oh, I'll make it like 20 minutes, and it's almost an hour. I'm sorry. It's exciting stuff. So, as always, if you have questions, feel free to let me know. And if you want more of this, take Anthropology of the Supernatural with Matthew in the fall. You'll really enjoy it.